The word collective consciousness was a term coined by the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. And of course, a lot of people who misconstrue what people like myself talk about, we're not bashing anything when we talk about Mitwelt and our domestic duties. It's not about erasing those completely. It's certainly not about running away from them. It's again about a way of seeing. It's about the way you do what you do, not necessarily what you do. So in terms of even collectivism, there's a small c collectivism, which is us all sitting here, the ebb and flow, you know, the interactions that we have on a mercurial level in daily society. We all need each other. I mean, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, everyone's proven that everything we have is by exchange. So the practical daily ebb and flow, you know, even the sexual needs and so on, the practical needs, we're not looking at that at all. We're looking at the psychic need to immerse oneself in those states of consciousness. It's the total immersion so that one is not listening to the voice of the imperial self. And E. Lindemann of Harvard, he says that modern research shows that much of what appeared to be biological inheritance is in fact cultural inheritance, transmitted socially, right? Mitwelt. This equilibrium of the individual, mental health, would therefore be dependent on his interaction with other members of the social network. So they understand now that far even more than genetic or biological predisposition, your character, your equilibrium, your mental health, your pathology, your sanity is largely dependent on your proximity and conditioning of those around you. It's basic. Positive aspects of collectivism, we're all human beings. As I said, one body is more or less like another. When one baby cries in a room, other babies often begin to cry. When one person smiles, we tend to spontaneously do the same. The female menstrual cycle, women who spend a lot of time together, it will synchronize. Sociologist, communist, or let's just say socialist, Daniel de Leon, when man started on his career, after having got beyond the stage of the savage, he realized that cooperation was a necessity to him, right? Obviously. He understood that together with others, he could face his enemies in a better way than alone. He could hunt, fish, fight more successfully. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, said that the mutual dependence of men is so great in all societies that scarce any human action is entirely complete in itself, or is performed without some reference to the actions of others. In short, this experimental inference and reasoning concerning the actions of others enters so much into human life that no man, while awake, is ever a moment without employing it. Have we not reason, therefore, to affirm that all mankind have always agreed in the doctrine of necessity according to the foregoing definition and explication of it? So when it comes to daily necessities, even Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, yeah, many people don't want to live in cities with other people or in any kind of republic, but we coax them to do it because there's benefits of doing so. Right? The house you live in, you didn't build yourself. The meat you eat, you didn't kill yourself. So there's a compromise. You compromise some individuality for some of the necessities of life. Some of the great proponents of this collectivism, one is Jürgen Habermas, and of course Ludwig Wittgenstein on the left there. Habermas points out that we become slaves by communication and, slaves, no. Yeah. Dr. Freud, take a memo. We become selves by communication and interaction with other selves. We speak to be understood. These two guys were big on language and communication. Big. The two top thinkers on words and communication. We speak to be understood. And when we speak, we watch others and their responses to what we say. We change as a result of those responses. Eye contact, watching the facial movements and so on. Body language. They say that the self that I spoke of, the imperial self, they're claiming is basically a construct of society. And it's very important to find out whether these pragmatists and positivists are accurate. It has enormous consequences for us psychologically and spiritually, if they turn out to be right. As I said earlier, are we just what other people have made us? But one of the biggest proponents, in fact almost the father of pragmatism, the philosophy known as pragmatism, George Herbert Mead, had a lot to say on this. And he says that the individual mind can exist only in relation to other minds with shared meanings. So he's basically saying that a mind is a collective entity. Commentary on Mead points out that joint activity, including communicative activity, is the means through which our sense of self is constituted. There's Mitwell, to the max. You are what you are entirely because of the group in which you live. They've done research on this. They say if you go to this tribe, and we've done it. The idioms, the customs, the humor, it's 100% based on your society, your social setting. Commentary on Mead says the individual organism also takes in the collective attitudes of others in the form of gestures and reacts accordingly. This process is characterized by Mead as the I and the me. So there's, again, he splits it. In other words, the I is the response of an individual to the attitudes of others, while the me is the organized set of attributes of others which the individual assumes. On the surface, this all sounds fantastic. The I is self as subject. The me is self as object. The I is the knower, the me is the known. You can look these up yourself later on and digest it clearer than we have time to delve into here. The mind or stream of thought is the self-reflective movements of the interaction between the I and the me. For Mead, the thinking process is the internalized dialogue between the I and the me. For Mead, existence in community comes before individual consciousness. First, one must participate in the different social positions within society, and only subsequently can one use that experience to take the perspective of others and thus become self-conscious. Theodore Reich, psychologist, said that the intermediary stage between the observation of others and self-observation, remember even James saying we had no I, even a few thousand years ago, there wasn't any concept of subjectivity at all. Well, in a way, these people are sort of footnoting what he was talking about. The intermediary stage between the observation of others and self-observation is thus the realization that one is observed by others. The self-observation is not a primary phenomenon. It must be traced back to being observed. One part of the self observes another part. So when mother's looking at you, when other people are looking at you, you see that they're looking at someone. And their act of gaze, and Ponty would love this because again you're dealing with perception, this phenomenon of perception which is deep. But just the very act of somebody looking at you gives rise to you mimicking that, embodying that, where you begin to look at yourself and you divide into the I and the me. One is an observer, the other is the observed. It takes two, says Reich, to practice psychology, even psychological self-observation. When you want to recognize and understand what takes place in the minds of others, you first have to look into yourself. Such a searching is only possible when a division of yourself has preceded the observation. Self-observation is the result of a late phase of psychology. Nietzsche remarked, "The thou is older than the I." Every child is selfish, but it is at first not interested in itself. There is not even a clear-cut self. Primitive observation is directed to the person or the persons in the environment. There is no direct path from observation of others to self-observation. The thou remains for a long time the only object. The I is but newly an object of observation, so young that many psychologists had not discovered it as an object worthy of their attention until recently. So look how young we are. Humans are social animals. By nature, we bond with others, live with others, work and play with others. Our whole lives are spent in some kind of interaction or relationship with other people. No matter how we look at it, we cannot ignore the fact that we are fundamentally connected with other people in our world around us. Other behaviors, thoughts, and feelings are all influenced by others. In turn, we influence those around us. Certainly, individuals have different degrees of influence and reciprocation. The concept of group consciousness, says Percival Simmons, and of group identification is necessary for the further development of the self. A child is to learn that he is a boy and different from a girl, that he is white instead of and different from a Negro, that he is poor and different from those who are rich. In these perceptions of difference, the child is learning to identify himself with a group or groups, and these group identifications are intrinsic aspects of the development of the self. In other words, we mirror others, and they mirror us. So, what that continuity, that biographical self, we can call it an I, it's all semantics, a me, a self, or there could be all three, depending on the relationships we have, and also the relationship that we have with ourselves. The creator of the positivist movement, the materialist philosophy, Auguste Comte, said that humanity is the only thing that can exist because we owe our whole development to society, no matter how we look at it. Truth to tell, it is the idea of the individual that is abstract. Now, we're a fly on the wall at this point because this is what they believe, right? They take a page out of these positivists. Christopher Lasch, in his fine book, A Culture of Narcissism, says that the human infant is born too soon. We come into the world utterly unable to provide for our biological needs and therefore completely dependent on those who take care of us. The experience of helplessness is all the more painful because it is preceded by the oceanic contentment of the womb, as Freud called it, which we spend the rest of our lives trying to recapture. The newborn experiences hunger and separation for the first time and senses its helplessness, its helpless, inferior, and dependent position in the world, so different from the omnipotence of the womb, where need and gratification were experienced as emanating from the same source. Repeated experiences of gratification and the expectation of their return gradually give the infant the inner confidence to tolerate hunger, discomfort, and emotional pain. But these same experiences also reinforce an awareness of separation and helplessness. As the infant learns to distinguish itself from its surroundings, it begins to understand that its own wishes do not control the world. Arno Gruen says, to be born human is to be born in danger, because everything we come to know and do as human beings we must learn from others. Furthermore, because we are the most impressionable, flexible, and malleable of all creatures, we are capable of being taught learning not only more than is sound, but also more than is unsound than any other living creature. The result is not intelligence, but confusion. Our socializers, parents, teachers of every kind, bent on perpetuating the errors which have been visited upon them by their socializers, and perceiving them as eternal truths pertaining to the raising and disciplining of children, commit, with more or less the best intentions, the most awful atrocities upon their victims. A deformation process called upbringing, a crippling of the child's potentialities for the realization of its own uniqueness. So in other words, he's talking about the blurring. This is such an overwhelming form of conditioning that almost from point go, the so-called self, the I, that's why these pragmatists say it doesn't exist. Well, I thought you were meant to be top philosophers or something. I thought you were meant to be from one of these prestigious universities. But you don't know that, of course, the reason why you think the I doesn't exist is because from point go, it doesn't have a moment to even breathe. And by the way, do you see the logical inconsistency of what Mead and others are saying? They're saying that you only understand the self or the I because others are looking at you and you digest the fact that you're being looked at and you then understand yourself as an object. But surely you must see the contradiction of that. Surely you must at least have even the most rudimentary sense of I-ness to even register that. Right? Right? Let's get clear on this. I mean, it could be just me, sitting at home, thinking about it, right? No, but I would say, look, hang on. Not only are you people wrong when you say that there's no I, you haven't given them a chance to speak. But more than that, even in the most rudimentary way, if I notice my mum looking at me, or staring at me, for goodness sake, I must have some matrix of an I-ness to even notice that. But they're the ones with the degrees. So that leads you, to wonder then. Go back to the original question. We know that this social self, this construct, is ever-changing as we move through the Mitwelt. We certainly know that there's an imperial I that seems to stay consistent through all of that, which these people tend to not want to admit exists. But certainly we must ask ourselves a question. Is our self only a persona, only a mirroring of other people? And what happens if those people aren't particularly sane? In fact, what happens if they're completely pathological? So, the danger that threatens, yet again we repeat, the problem is that underneath our social persona there may be no imperial self. There's many people of the highest bracket believe there isn't one. So then how do we find out? Ask other people, that just perpetuates the problem. You have to go in and listen, think it out, or strip away, layer by layer, all of the other conditioning, might you not? Now, on the one hand, interacting with other people and being extrovert and social allows us to develop beyond the infantile or animistic stage. So-called pleasure principle, I'm not denying that. You watch how other people do things, right from their posture to the, you go to school, you're looking at all the other kids, Obviously. However, too much immersion in the world of other people can mean a loss of ego identity. Others become the measure of our worth, and our estimation of what is good and bad in ourselves rests not on our own rational understanding, but on the expectations of the herd. And we're all doing it. Now, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was the first to critique what he referred to as the herd morality and the herd instinct in human society. He was the #1 guy to realize about all of this immersion and loss of self. Most everybody else talking about it is a footnote to this guy. He says, in individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. There's the danger. There's the danger that threatens. His contemporary, Arthur Schopenhauer, said that we forfeit 3/4 of ourselves in order to be like other people. Alan Watts said that we seldom realize that our most private thoughts and emotions are not actually our own, for we think in terms of languages and images which we did not invent, but which were given to us by our society. We copy emotional reactions from our parents. Society is our extended mind and body. Something left out by Mead again. It's a reciprocal circuit. But he's pointing out this thing. Taken to its extreme, that's just telling you that your mind is 100% colonized. As we said earlier on, yeah, you can think about territorialism and imperialist action and all sorts of jackbooting in the physical thing. That's been documented 1,000,000 times. And I'm all for remedying it. But how the hell are you going to remedy that when your mind is colonized? That's like cleaning a window with a greasy rag and then complaining you can't see the view. Eric Newman, psychologist, Jungian. Among primitives, and wherever the conditions are primitive, the conflict between the individual consciousness and the collective tendencies of the unconscious is resolved in favor of the collective at the cost of the individual. That's the fallout. That's the problem. In other words, the self basically ceases to be our focus, and the world and other people subsume it, take its place. The great French sociologist, Alain Touraine, says that modern man is constantly threatened by the absolute power of society. Rand says the social theory of ethics substitutes society for God, and although it claims that its chief concern is life on earth, it is not the life of man, nor the life of the individual, but the life of disembodied entity, the collective. They're thinking in terms of the collective and the species. And the Darwinists will try to tell you fraudulently that so does nature think that way and act that way. Well, according to you, yeah, not anybody else. The internal psychic representative, or agent, I say, of the parents and the Mittelwelt is known technically in the jargon of psychology as the superego. Very, very important to understand the anatomy of consciousness. So how does this happen? They didn't explain earlier what is the engine of this? How does this happen? Part of the ego, separate from the ego, called the superego, takes care of this. It is the inner representative of all that external authority, primarily the parents. And one could, split hairs and start talking about one of the parents is prohibitive, the other is permissive. In the Victorian society, when Freud wrote, that was more true. That has just gone to pieces in modern age because the mother can be very prohibitive, the father can be extremely permissive, there can be one-parent families, so that's a little bit, doesn't mean that Freud was wrong, as a lot of people try to insist. It just means that time has moved on, and had he lived, he also would have updated his theories. Now, the superego molds the ego into the shape desired by society. It attempts to find a harmonious relationship between the Umwelt and the personal will. When this harmony breaks down, neurotic symptoms occur. So, psychologists, all of them, whether they admit it or not, and certainly those who are in the Freudian school do admit it, Their primary work on you when you come with neurotic tendencies is to work on the superego. That's why they ask you about your parents. It's not some psychobabble nonsense to make money. It's because they have to ask, what was your relationship with those authority figures in the beginning? Because you are embodying, and the next step is to find out about this inner tyrant, this inner policeman, the embodiment of all of that. And how you might be beating yourself up when you don't do as you're told by the almighty fathers. And to make the point that the consciousness is split. I mean, ego, superego, id. There's a division taking place there. There's an inner dialogue between those hemispheres, right? But shadow, very important. A lot of people talking about the shadow, especially in the New Age movement. Books are written. Not one sentence I found to be either accurate or even even pertinent. The shadow, so-called, that we all have to face, and I agree with that you need to integrate the so-called shadow. But what does the word shadow mean? It's incorporeal, isn't it? It's a shadow of something else. Just like your physical shadow is. So what is the shadow thrown by? Well, the mind. Yes, but it's more than the mind. The shadow is ultimately the superego's shadow. And if this was pointed, it needs to be pointed out in the introduction, but you don't find it. It is the superego structure that is casting the so-called shadow that needs to be integrated. In other words, that which is repressed by the superego. It's doing the repressing. Repression being that you forget something and then forget that you forgot about it. So the shadow is in fact the creation of the superego. Or what? What was superego a metaphor for? Society. So the shadow is not some weird psychic hobgoblin in the back of your head, as often in fiction and in psychobabble it is portrayed. No. You couldn't have a shadow without this dynamic of interacting with society, being prohibited by society, and then repressing those traits that society doesn't like. There is called the shadow. And the parts that you have learned to hate and despise about yourself, we'll get the sadism in the next section. Therefore, do you not see that the shadow is not in fact personal? Now, Jung did admit this. Jung did speak about this, because he's the one who really coined the term shadow. When I say that Freud referred to it, it was not in that term. Therefore, the shadow is collective. The shadow is not necessarily yours. This is very important to realize. The shadow is not yours. It is all of society's impositions and restrictions upon you. And then the famous journey to the underworld, right, which is as old as the myths, by the way, and in all the lands, is the hero, the son, going into the underworld to then face and embrace that shadow, an age-old concept, embrace the beast, which is the self. Because what is the shadow? Even the textbooks tell you it is the repressed content of yourself. It's parts of yourself that you've had to reject because it's been censored by society. The Lakota Indians call it the shadow man. And he comes out during war. And they do rituals to thank him for coming out in war. Now, the conflict between the ego and the superego, or we can say the will in the world, is often the main reason for the laundry list of syndromes such as depression, melancholia, anxiety, futility, antisocial behavior, aggression, and so on, and self-sadism. We'll come to that. Of course, we all know that sexual drives are the first target of the repressive censor, hence the normal state of anxiety and tension within human beings. The best person who addressed that is Wilhelm Reich. He was a contemporary of Freud, and he went into this deeper than Freud ever did. But it's obviously a generalized coffee table fact that it is the sexual desires in children, especially when they go to school, that is the first target of the parental, social, and then ultimately inner repression and dissociation. That's a given. You don't need to explore it. Now, Neo-Freudians realized that the dynamics and mores of man's societies dramatically influence the internal forces of repression, or the superego. Society's demand for conformity is the leading cause of pathology. It's the creation of the shadow. As societies become more suppressive, we've been talking about where we're going, right? As they become more suppressive, you repress, they suppress. Right? Society suppresses and you pick up the slack and do the repressing. As these societies become more suppressive and closed, the superego likewise becomes more repressive, scathing and tormenting, forcing the individual to feel and to be increasingly alienated and anxious. As the superego drags the ego towards the world, as the conformity and collectivism increase, there is a corresponding repression of the self, hence more anxiety of the kinds we described in the beginning. So the superego is also key. The valve of the superego is key to the level of anxiety that we feel, both of the neurotic kind and also of the other kind. It's pathology, psychopathy, because of not getting it. And the full manifestation of it on a social level, perhaps not individual but social, is the global village. The extreme version of it is, I am you, you are me. Herbert Mead's wet dream. I am who I am because of everyone. Well, that doesn't even make any sense. That's even self-contradictory. Fromm says, the majority of well-adapted individuals have lost their own self at an early age and replaced it completely with the social self offered to them by society. They have no neurotic conflicts because they themselves, and therefore the discrepancy between themselves and the outside world, have disappeared. What he's talking about there is that you've repressed the imperial self to such a degree that other kind of anxiety doesn't even happen anymore. The suppression and the repression have done their work. Now we learn to understand the significance of the voice hallucinations play, right? They play a distinct role in the symptomatology of certain psychotic disturbances, right? Psychotics talk about hearing voices. Those patients hear voices that speak to them in the third person and incessantly comment on and criticize their actions and failures to act. Freud traced those voices back to the parental criticism. The development of consciousness, the development of conscience is regressively reproduced by those patients who reproject the voices into the outer world from which they originally came. So the superego is on overdrive. The patient doesn't know what is happening. All it hears is, I'm a bad guy, I'm this, I'm lost. And then in order to balance that out, they believe they're Napoleon or Jesus Christ. They do that because they're so needing to quieten that voice by having some self-esteem that it's also out of control. The person is just overwhelmed by the inner dictator. Now, Vance Packard said that early in the 50s, Fortune magazine viewed the trend uneasily and used the Orwellian word groupthink to describe much of what was going on. It suggested that businessmen, while deploring creeping socialism in Washington, might well look at some of the subtle but pervasive changes going on right in their own backyard. Its writer, William H. White, Jr., stated, a very curious thing has been taking place in this country, almost without our knowing it. In a country where individualism, independence, and self-reliance was the watchword for 3 centuries, the view is now coming to be accepted that the individual himself has no meaning except as the member of a group. So it was instilled. It's by design. It's a hallmark of socialism. Jung says that the man of today, who resembles more or less the collective ideal, has made his heart into a den of murderers, as can easily be proved by the analysis of his unconscious, even though he himself is not in the least bit disturbed by it. We're knee-deep in these people. And as we know, inner sadism soon becomes external sadism. Now these leaders, they think of themselves as the buyers and sellers of human beings. In fact, Francis Bacon's term for them was the merchants of light. That's heavy. And they're just inventors of the new improved model. That's what their global village is all about. And you know what they know? They know that freedom itself is a very, very young phenomena. Remember I said before that they think, I'm not giving up my power because who replaces me will be just as bad as me. You're all the same, so why should I give it up? They also know that freedom, the freedom that everyone's crying about, they go, you must be crazy, that's about 5 minutes old. And you know something? They're right. Eric Fromm explains, what characterizes medieval in contrast to modern society is its lack of individual freedom. Everybody in the earlier period was chained to his role in the social order. A man had little choice to move socially from one class to another. He was hardly able to move even geographically from one town or from one country to another. With few exceptions, he had to stay where he was born. He was often not even free to dress as he pleased or to eat what he liked. Medieval society did not deprive the individual of his freedom because the individual did not exist. So now the social individual did not exist. Sociologists accept that as being the individual is a recent invention, a recent phenomena. The Julian Jameses are saying, look, your thought of you being an individual is relatively young. And Big Brother thinks, yeah, and it's not good for you. We're going to take away what you have of it. Thomas Saz says the birth of psychiatry occurs when the study of the human soul is transferred from religion to medicine, when the cure of souls becomes the treatment of mental diseases, and most importantly, when the repression of the heretic madman ceases to be within the jurisdiction of the priest and becomes the province of the psychiatrist. Oh, that nasty craving for freedom. We'll take care of that. It'll just plague you to death, that will. You know, Patrick McGowan's worst nightmare. Now, these spirits have usurped. This is one of the psychopaths who was one of these early psychologists who believed that these medical men, especially, were saints on earth. He actually called them saints and saviors. These spirits, he says, have usurped control over the earth, and that all those who are mentally disturbed have become so through their power. They have a common starting point, a main principle to which they are subordinated: selfishness. So in the earliest days, they believed that everyone who was deranged, everyone who had any aberrant characteristics, it was that devilish selfishness and individuality that was causing them to act that way, causing them all that disturbance. Well, we got to build. These architects built the madhouses, the bedlams, the untold suffering of millions. Innocent people, good people, artists, creative, sensitive geniuses were incarcerated because they had this bug called selfishness. This most evil of all evils, he says, is present in the most remote and even in the closest human relations. It is absorbed in the mother's milk and finds a fertile soil in the human heart. What kind of psychopath is this? If it's in the mother's milk, then leave it alone. The same monstrosities exist today with their new updated version of the global village, the gulag, the bedlam. It's my conviction that the human race, says Mikhail Gorbachev, has entered a stage where we are all dependent on each other. No other country or nation should be regarded in total separation from another, let alone pitted against another. That's what our communist vocabulary calls internationalism, and it means promoting universal human values. It's double speak. It's the erosion of all human values. More socialism, he says, means more democracy. There's that talismanic word. Openness and collectivism in everyday life. Hillary Clinton, an expert on the subject. We must stop thinking of the individual and start thinking about what's best for society. That's a classic. I'm already chills with the first word. You want to stop thinking about individuals? Start thinking about what, remember that? Think about the species, think about the collectives. We are you. They'll have headsets later. It'll be coming out of the speakers. We are you. I am everyone. And the mushroom heads get in on the game. You remember they were in it at the beginning. Who can fail to see the need and importance of thus gradually coming to the establishment of a world authority capable of taking effective action on the judicial and political planes? Delegates to the international organizations, public officials, gentlemen of the press, teachers and educators, all of you must realize that you have your part to play in the construction of a new world order. This Jesuit Mason Rettinger co-founded the Bilderberg Group. Jesuit. Joseph Rettinger. Money from Prince Bernhard. Religion, royalty, crown and gown, double-headed eagle, cross and crown. Behind the desks and the lodge door, they're laughing at thinking we believe all the blue and green and the blue and red divisions of outside. They love it. Queen Beatrix, a Bilderberger Group member, she says it is difficult, very, very difficult. They're recalcitrants. It's very difficult to re-educate people who have been brought up on nationalism to the idea of relinquishing part of their sovereignty to a supranational body. We'll get round to it, but it's tough work. Remember that Tom Ridge quote during 9/11? Civil liberties is the most precious gift we bestow or we give our citizens. Remember that? The Pennsylvania governor. The man himself. He said, the sacrifice of personal existence Now look at this. The sacrifice of personal existence is necessary to secure the preservation of the species. Robert Temple, in Open to Suggestion, a book I highly recommend, along with Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd, says that Hitler was a student of the crowd, the famous book by Gustave Le Bon, which founded crowd psychology. It is time we paid this subject more attention, as so many millions of people have died as a result of it. They have an ideology behind everything they're doing. The influence of repetition on crowds is comprehensible when the power is seen which it exercises on the most enlightened minds. This power, says Le Bon, is due to the fact that the repeated statement is embedded in the long run in those profound regions of our unconscious selves in which the motives of our actions are forged. At the end of a certain time, we have forgotten who is the author of the repeated assertion, and we finish by believing it. We're talking about embedded ideas. The global village, the iron cage of bureaucracy, the village, is basically technically called a superorganism. That's what it is. Entities within that organism simply can't survive on their own if removed from it. That's the plan. It's been moving that way for generations. As I said, Michel Foucault called it total institution. Look that word up. He also referred to it as governmentality. Government, control of the mind. Gubernare, to row or to steer, to navigate, or to control the direction of something. Menta is mind. Now this superorganism is a product of the superego. That is, of our inner surveiller. We are always watched. We are always safe. We make our society the panopticon and become what Foucault referred to as docile bodies. We've already explained how that happens when you self-mutilate yourself. In effect, we are panopticonized. Are we not? Eric Fromm says the sick individual finds himself at home with other similarly sick individuals. The whole culture is geared to this kind of pathology. The result is that the average individual does not experience the separateness and isolation the fully schizophrenic person feels. Remember, the schizophrenic being the one who's tried to hang on to the last vestiges of what his imperial self has, under all the weight of his terribly torn mind. That's why they have the troubles they do. That's why they're in the state that they are. Remember that scene in Pink Floyd, The Wall, where after he just goes through the incredible rite of passage and he smashes up the hotel room, which is a metaphor for his mind. He slowly, methodically, piece by piece, picks up every broken shard and makes this amazing mandala of it all. Remember that scene? That is what the schizophrenic has to do, to be born again from the flames. Order out of disorder, a Zen action, creation out of destruction. But not everybody can do that, and sometimes it's quite impossible to do it. In the Psychic Vampirism, we're going to get detailed case histories, quotes from schizophrenics that will tell you about what goes on in their own minds and the hell that they've gone through in relationship to the authorities around them. And also how they were being categorized and shunted aside and restrained. Le Bon says that it's easy to prove how much the individual forming a part of a crowd differs from the isolated individual, but it is less easy to discover the causes of the difference. The most careful observation seems to prove that an individual immersed for some length of time in a crowd, in action, soon finds himself, either in consequence of the magnetic influence given out by a crowd, or some other cause of which we are ignorant, in a specific state which must resemble the state of fascination in which the hypnotized individual finds himself at the hands of the hypnotizer. So he's mesmerized, he's colonized, he's enthralled, enthralldom. It's also known as participation mystique, a primitive concept. M. Esther Harding says that the man caught up in such an identification loses his capacity to make an individual judgment. He relinquishes his autonomy and vests it for the time being in a group. Thus he is no longer in any real sense an individual. He is only a member of a group, identical in all respects with other members. What they do, he does. What they feel, he feels. What they think, he thinks. And what they ignore, he too ignores. It's like a form of reverse possession. But the man who's psychically little, right? The little man, the psychically little, he feels this largesse by hanging around a bunch of other, likewise, broken souls. Eric Newman speaks about the participation mystique. He says, so long as the ego was swimming in the belly of the Ouroboros, a mere ego germ, it shared in that paradisical perfection. This autocracy holds absolute sway in the womb, where unconscious existence is combined with absence of suffering. Everything is supplied of its own accord. There is no need for the slightest exertion, not even an instinctive reaction, let alone the regulating ego consciousness. One's own being and the surrounding world, in this case the mother's body, exists in a participation mystique never more to be attained in any environmental relationship. He's wrong. They're working on it. They know that. And they want to go back before the ego. Before the tiresome superego, they're going to do it all for you. They've got an injection ready, a pill waiting, a global village incarceration for you, into which we will walk. If we haven't got the imperial self on absolute max, we won't have any choice, because the crowd is heading in that direction. They're going to create that womb. Watch Demolition Man with Sylvester Stallone and other movies of that type. Equilibrium and so on. They're literally knowing that remember I said they know our psychology, they understand the libido, the sexual hang-ups, they understand history, they know where we've come from, they know that all these things are recent. They're working to create Mama, another great female womb, but a technical one, an artificial one. That's why a lot of the symbolism around this is water, female, feminine, statues of liberties, and God knows what else. Even the design of the malls and so on. Watch out for this female symbolism. Because they know that that's the lure. And if we don't know how to resist that lure, we're on the hook. Le Bon says that the conviction of crowds assumes those characteristics of blind submission, fierce intolerance, and the need of violent propaganda, which are inherent in their religious sentiment, and that is for this reason that it may be said that all their beliefs have a religious form, right? They're always shaking hands with some mushroom head. The hero acclaimed by the crowd is a veritable god for that crowd. The crowd demands a god before everything else. This is another mysteria. And Louis Lapland says that no matter how effusive our rhetoric to the contrary, most Americans cannot bring themselves to trust the unaffiliated individual. We prefer to repose our confidence in institutions, a brand name, a corporation, a bank. It is the figure of Babbitt and Cyrus Vance, not Clint Eastwood, who represents the triumph of the American dream. George Simmel, the sociologist, practically the creator of sociology, he says that the deepest problems of modern life flow from the attempt of the individual to maintain his independence and individuality of his existence against the sovereign powers of society, against the weight of the historical heritage and the external culture and technique of life. The antagonism represents the most modern form of the conflict which primitive man must carry on with nature for his own bodily existence. So we haven't progressed anything at all. We're still working with the jungle, just in a different way. Fromm says that the vast majority of people in our culture are well adjusted because they've given up the battle for independence sooner and more radically than the neurotic person. They have accepted the judgment of the majority so completely that they've been spared the sharp pain of conflict which the neurotic person goes through. He's speaking about the positive neurosis of you trying to resist. Otherwise these quotes wouldn't be understandable unless we had laid that down. While they are healthy from the standpoint of adjustment, they are more sick than the neurotic person from the standpoint of the realization of their aims as human beings, the insanity of normalcy. Jung says that it is a notorious fact that the morality of the society as a whole is in inverse ratio to its size. For the greater the aggregation of individuals, the more the individual factors are blotted out, and with them morality, which rests entirely on the moral sense of the individual and the moral necessity for this. Hence, every man is, in a certain sense, unconsciously a worse man when he is in society or in a group than when acting alone. So these Queen Beatrixes and these Hillary Clintons, that's what they're working on. They want you to get rid of that individuality, knowing that the morality goes with it. They want that because they're immoral. But if you're equally immoral, then you can't blame them, you see. So their filth and their dirt and their crime, hey, why is the kettle calling the pot black here? It's like any local criminal in court standing up there in the dock going, well, they stole from me, trying to mitigate his case. That's what they're doing. Jung goes on to say, for he is carried by society and to that extent relieved of his individual responsibility. Now you start seeing the true reasons why we go for it. Any large company composed of wholly admirable persons has the morality and intelligence of an unwieldy, stupid and violent animal. The bigger the organization, the more unavoidable is its immorality and its blind stupidity. Go and ask the Icelandic people what happened to them. Go and now find out what this mob rule, this cliques, how they can even do what they do. Because one of our questions is, how can they do what they do? How can they sleep at night? Well, if there's no individuality there, there's no conscience to worry them. Fromm says that society is divided into two groups. Of those seeking to break their mental and emotional coding and actualize selfhood, right? The imperial self and the legitimate anxiety crowd. And those seeking only to conform and sacrifice their identity to the many ideologies, lifestyles, and cults which proliferate, and which are designed to erase personal identity and reward collectivism. You try telling that to your parents in state, just by design. They're ready to send you to the cookie farm. But the top intellects have said it, written it down. Now those who conform, who remain within the relative comfort zone, who never aspire towards independence of thought or action, and who even suppress those who do, deeply hate themselves for their love of falseness, for their material attachments, and for their systematic weakness. Right? Now he's touching on where we're going later. The nerve of the self-hatred that's breeding, festering under people, especially these big boys at the top. This hatred must at times be vicariously processed. This is achieved in myriad fascinating ways. Age of Manipulation 3. We'll find out the fascinating ways of what he's talking about. The vicarious processing through you, through your field, through your consciousness, through your cells. Then you wonder why you're feeling depressed and unhealthy. And why life is so tough. While you're resting your head on the bosom of the one who's causing it all. The more severe manifestation of such violence is obviously war. So in other words, all the cacophony and chaos that you see, we know it's orchestrated, yes, but it's also a necessary vicarious processing of this inner Armageddon that's going on within. And when we get the solutions, we'll find out what to do about it. Now this surrender of one's own self has often been praised as the example of the great love. Look at my medals. It's actually it's a form of idolatry and also the annihilation of the self, except it's in physical terms. In war, they're just dying in the trenches. But that person is probably already psychically dead long time before. Their humanity and their sense of self has already been long killed off. What does it matter to them how many millions die? As Colin Powell said, it's just a statistic, I'm not interested in it. Now the drive is also rooted in a deep anxiety and an inability to stand alone, but instead of finding increased strength by being swallowed, strength and security are found in having a limited power over the other person. The masochistic as well as the sadistic kind of love are expression of one basic need which springs from a basic inability to be independent. And Arnold Gruen puts it in succinct terms. He says that distorted development of autonomy is the root cause of all the pathological and ultimately evil element in human beings. They pick up the pieces, there's no doubt about it. You don't need politicians and religious leaders to lead you astray. He goes on to say, the more love, this is Freud, the more love I turn towards the outside world, the less love I have for myself. People cringe when you say that. And vice versa. Freud is thus moved to describe the phenomenon of falling in love as an impoverishment of one's self-love, because all love is turned to an object outside of oneself. We are very young. We have a lot to learn. What is the point of loving somebody who doesn't love themselves? And do you really expect them to give you love if they have no clue how to love themselves? Keep doing it. In popular usage, says Rand, the word selfishness is a synonym of evil. Actually, nails it. The image it conjures is of a murderous brute who tramples over piles of corpses to achieve his own ends, who cares for no living being and pursues nothing but the gratification of the mindless whims of any immediate moment. Yet the exact meaning and dictionary definition of the word selfishness is simply concern with one's own interests. Look how much erosion has taken place. She described us as living in an orgy of self-sacrifice. Now, this thing becomes important to understand because the collectivist mindset, and those who have embodied it that you'll be meeting, watch for this one. In their mind, the collectivist imagines that everything he thinks about and produces or creates or has an opinion on, but also, produces and creates, is everyone's property. That's what Ayn Rand went to great lengths to show and dramatize, that everything I've got, the collectivist says, and everything I think about, that's everyone's property. Only trouble is they don't overemphasize the other side of that. Everything you think about, have an opinion on, and create is his property. It doesn't sound so good, does it? Everything you think about, everything you create, everything you do is everybody else's property. I thought that constituted rape. Rand goes on to say, a society that robs an individual of the product of his effort or enslaves him or attempts to limit the freedom of his mind or compels him to act against his own rational judgment, a society that sets up a conflict between its edicts and its requirements of man's nature, is not strictly speaking a society but a mob held together by institutionalized gang rule. Professor Charles Osgood and his colleague, Stuart Umpleby, they write, in the organization of a civilization of the future, we anticipate that the individualistically oriented man will become an anachronism. Indeed, he will be viewed as a threat to the group organization as well as to his fellow man. They're for it, by the way. Hence, as stated, he in all likelihood will have few individual expectations. While such a picture may not be pleasant to contemplate, we should be amiss to deal with unrealistic imageries that would blind us to the future reality. They can't wait, you see, they can't wait. Bertrand Russell said it this way, diet, injections, and injunctions will be combined from an early age to produce the sort of character and the sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable, and any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. That's why I'm saying you now see us rebelling and creating blogs and all sorts of things and waving placards. You see, that might not even be happening tomorrow. That's why it's deeper. The perfect slave is being created. Hail the providers. The French poet Charles Péguy said that tyranny is always better organized than freedom. Tyranny is always better organized than freedom. And if you're disorganized mentally and emotionally, handrails. Now, Fromm says, it is the feeling of isolation, of being shut out, which is the painful thing in every neurosis. Even the most irrational orientation, if it is shared by a considerable body of men, gives the individual the feeling of oneness with others. So if all you're looking for is that approval and those cues and affectations, you don't mind what they're doing. You really don't mind who they're slaughtering. You'll sit at the bottom of a pyramid going, that was a bigger heart than the last guy, as it's being cut out and eaten. Well, he had a lot of blood, didn't he? That was a real good one. Didn't they come in gangs to watch hangings and bring their kids and the sweeties and the marshmallows in the medieval days to watch some poor guy be hung, drawn, and quartered because he tried to kill the king, the real tyrant? They used to go in the body while the man is still alive, the criminal, they'd carve with a knife some passage from the Bible, or I repent. Or the name of the king. That's what it was. The name of the king was actually cut into the chest. You're owned. So he says here that even the most irrational orientation, if it is shared by a considerable body of men, gives the individual the feeling of oneness with others and a certain amount of security and stability which the neurotic person lacks. There's nothing inhuman, evil, or irrational which does not give some comfort, provided it is shared by the group. So, how much does the welfare, we ask the question, take a break right now, but, to make it very personal to us. It's not accusatory or anything, but we need to start asking the question, yes, how much does the welfare and behavior of other people preoccupy our minds? Don't criticize yourself for thinking that way. Don't repeat more self-sadism. Observe it just purely Zen. Just observe it scientifically. Take a day, a 24-hour period, a 48-hour period, or a month, or a week, and just admit it to yourself how much the welfare and the existence of any other people, doesn't matter who it is, preoccupies your thinking. Don't judge it, don't criticize it, and don't beat yourself up for it. Merely observe it, and many, many incredible things will happen. We'll come back and look more and unpack another aspect of this, which is crucial, the self-sadism. Let's take a short 10-15 minute break.